All right, welcome everyone to the panel on data science communication. And thank you for joining us today to discuss this topic, which I personally think is a really important topic in data science. And I'm really pleased today to have four fantastic panelists bring their various perspectives to the conversation about how do we go about teaching our students communication around data science. And I'm just going to briefly mention their names and their institutions, and then we will have them introduce themselves. So I've asked each panelist to introduce themselves, to take about 5 minutes to give us their background and also to give us some advice or some recommendations that they have taken from their experience in terms of teaching communication and setting up communication programs. And after that, we have a few prepared questions, and there will be pairs of panelists answering each of the prepared questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So our panelists today are Trity, Pourbahrami, and she is joining us from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Jeff Leek, who is a professor in biostatistics in the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. Sara Stoudt, who will be starting soon as an assistant professor at Bucknell University in the Department of Mathematics. And Amelia McNamara, who I think you've spent a year now, is that right, at St. 3 years? Oh my gosh, time flies. Is a professor in computer and information sciences. So why don't we just get started, and I will call on Trity to introduce herself.
Thank you, Deb. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I wish I could see your faces. I'm very much about interaction with people, so it's really weird not to have your faces up. So I'm a boundary spanner science communicator. What do I mean by that? I have kind of one foot in the practice of science communication and another in science communication education. So as Deb mentioned, currently I'm at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And in my current role, what that means is I find the most effective ways to tell science stories of our grantees through traditional and social media. That's one foot. The other foot is I provide customized communications coaching and advising to scientists and engineers to increase their effectiveness as advocates for their own research as well as for science as a whole. So turning back time, about 1.5 years ago, I was still at Caltech. I'd spent 10 years at Caltech as the director of communications there, and there I was also a boundary spanner. So there I directed the communications efforts of the Division of Engineering and Applied Science and collaborated with all of the divisions at Caltech. There's 6 divisions at Caltech, plus NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That was one foot. The other foot of my boundary spanning role was to design and teach graduate courses in effective science communication, and used it as a way to establish scientists and engineers as good communicators, and to come up with the first academic program at Caltech to guide scientists and engineers through becoming communicators that have a bigger impact. So in terms of starting our conversation today, I thought I would share with you my 5 tips. These are the 5 tips I give as a way to become better at communicating science, as a way to take what you have in your strengths to be more engaging in whatever it is that you're doing. So the 5 tips in short are: define your target audience, figure out your purpose, meet your audience where they are, begin with what's known, and finally, and very importantly, check your assumptions. So going back, let me give you a little bit more detail about what I'm talking about. So define your target audience, right? Like today, you don't know how wide and how broad your audience is, so you want to be clear about who you're targeting, right? And no matter what the conference is, no matter how big your class is, there's a subset that you can truly target. And you want to gain as much insight into the way they think and what would motivate them, such that you can really communicate with them. So for instance, if it's someone who you're trying to guide through graduate school to get their next job, it's a different target audience than if you're in a public forum and you're really trying to engage individuals on a topic that could affect public policy. And the second point is purpose, right? What is the core message you're trying to communicate? Be clear about the purpose of your communication. Think about what does your audience really need to know? Do you want them to feel confident in getting a vaccine? Do you want them to prepare an earthquake kit for the next time the big one hits? Do you want them to reduce their energy consumptions? Communicating science begins with knowing why you're communicating it and what you want your audience to do with the information you're communicating. Tip number 3, meet your audience where they're at. I find so often we're talking down to people, even in a classroom setting. Imagine taking the hand of your students and walking with them. Because to motivate someone to really take the data, the information, the knowledge that you're passing on, they need to feel connected. And in the time that we're living right now, which is the pandemic time and crisis, there are so many other layers of emotion and other just humanness, messiness to who we are, that unless we take the hand of our audience and we walk with them, we can't really communicate effectively. 4th tip, begin with what's known. I know as scientists, and my first training was in science, I'm a physicist and a physiologist to start off with, we are so fascinated by the edges, the uncertainties, the really interesting, unknown, emerging elements. For the majority of people, that triggers do they really know what they're talking about? And you don't want that. What you want is to come up with what is known, what's consensus science, and then move, if necessary, to the next stage. That applies to students, that applies to your neighbor, that applies to if you're talking to a policy member. Finally, my 5th point here is check your assumptions. So many of us are taught that the way to communicate is to identify the deficit, to identify the hole, and put as much information as we can into that hole, because then people will know. Then people will know your field, then people will know your research. The deficit model of communication, I'm very sorry to tell you all, does not work. What you need to do is figure out what motivates your audience and go from there. That's what I have.
Trity. All right. Next up, Amelia, would you please introduce yourselves?
Sure. This is going to be rough to follow Trity because I don't have anything nearly as polished and prepared. But I'm Amelia McNamara. Like Deb said, I currently teach at the University of St. Thomas, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. But just a little bit about my background. I did my PhD in statistics at UCLA, and I started thinking about data communication. At that point, I was awarded a Collegium of University Teaching Fellowship so I could teach a course as the instructor of record, and I decided to teach a small data visualization focused seminar where we just were reading existing data visualizations, like looking at and critiquing existing data visualizations. It's been a number of years, but I don't think that we did anything software related. It was not hands-on at all. And then after graduate school, I spent 3 years as a visiting assistant professor at Smith College in the program of statistical and data sciences, which was just getting off the ground there. And I taught 2 courses that were related to data communication there. One was a very intro level, no prerequisites, large lecture style class called Communicating with Data, which was, again, primarily about data visualization. We did, again, mostly read existing data visualizations, readings about data visualization, but they did a little bit of hands-on stuff using the online Plotly tool, and they did some hand-drawn data visualizations as well. And they had sort of an open-ended final project, which had some interesting outcomes. I also taught a slightly higher level course that was about data journalism. So that had a lot of statistics or data science majors who took it. And we focused on kind of 2 methods of communication. There was still some data visualization there because that's a crucial part of data journalism, but we also focused on writing about data, writing in a journalistic style. And we did lots of tools. We learned about spreadsheets. We did R, we did Git and GitHub. There was a little bit of Tableau. I think we did Open Refine. So that was like maybe too many tools. And then I transitioned to my current role at the University of St. Thomas. I'm in the Department of Computer and Information Sciences. And the course that I teach here that is communication related is called Data Communication and Visualization. And what I think is nice about this course is that it covers 3 modes of communication. So again, there's a lot of emphasis on data visualization, but we also talk about writing about data, and we talk about speaking about data orally, presenting. So I've taught it twice. I'm teaching it again in the fall. I've used Deb and Sara's book, which I'm sure Sara will mention, both times, and I'm going to be using it again. And I think it's a great course. A couple challenges. It's really hard to grade it. Like, how do you assess communication work? I think we're going to talk about that. And then there's this project that I've used a few times. I did it at Smith, and I've done it a couple times here, where students write Wikipedia articles about people who don't have them. It's a little bit of a tenuous connection to data communication, and then there's some major frustrations that go along with it, both for myself and the students, which I'm happy to talk more about as well.
Thanks, Amelia. And Jeff, you're up next. Will you please introduce yourself?
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm sort of the least qualified person to be on this panel, so I'm very excited to hear about all the other speakers and what I'm learning already things from the speakers. My name is Jeff. I'm a professor of biostatistics at Johns Hopkins. I also co-lead the Johns Hopkins Data Science Lab. We do a bunch of communication stuff really in the Data Science Lab around. We write a stats blog called Simply Statistics, and we have data science puppets that we do a lot of things with that are pretty fun. And we have a number of sort of podcasts that Roger Pang is our chief podcaster in chief. So does a bunch of podcasting, not so standard deviations, and the effort report. And then Stephanie Hicks is doing this amazing children's book about statisticians. And so there's a couple of things there. We also develop MOOCs, massive online open courses. So we have one called Written and Oral Communication in Data Science that's on LeanPub platform. That's part of a program that we teach actually in underserved communities in Baltimore. So we basically teach this MOOC program for people who have just finished their GED, and so get them some basic data management and data science training. And then at Hopkins, I do the other end of the spectrum. I teach advanced data science to our PhD students, where communication is a key component of it. And so all of this is experiential learning. I've read, Deb's book, and I've read Sara's book, and I've sort of learned, but I'm an amateur. So we try our best to sort of teach people about communication. I would just say that the only advice I really have about it is that if data cleaning is sort of 80% of the problem, communication is easily the other 60% of data science. So adding those numbers up is a fair description of what a data scientist's life is like. We tell our students to talk about what they care about and ignore, the data at the moment. First, think about what they care about. And we also say that people like to feel smart. So simplify even when it feels silly. Even if you feel like you're describing something that seems totally obvious to you, it's not always totally obvious to everyone else. And so take the time to be really simple. Not simple in a pedantic way, but just in a you should explain everything way. We talk a lot about the biggest challenge we often see in our students, and for me too, is analysis order versus communication order. You do a collection of 50,000 analyses when you're analyzing a data set, and you don't want to put them all in a document. You want to tell the story of what you did, and that means throwing a lot on the cutting room floor. I think that's one of the hardest things for at least our students to learn. And then the main thing that we've discovered just this last year with the pandemic is we instituted a policy where everyone had to communicate we did small groups where people would have to put up their analyses or put up their written reports, and they would talk about it. And sort of seeing what other people did was way more impactful than anything I did as a lecturer throughout the last few years, much to my chagrin. So anyway, those are the things that I've been doing, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing more from the other panelists as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And we'll round it out with Sara.
Hi, everyone. So like Deb said, I'm Sara Stoudt. My data communication origin story starts back at Berkeley. I was a PhD student there when I worked with Deb on creating and teaching a stats seminar on writing about statistics. So this is a small seminar through the Art of Writing program, about 15 students. Everyone had at least intro stat, knew how to work with R. So we could go straight to like analyzing a data set, writing about it, going through that revision process that you don't get to if you're doing a final project in something like Introstat. But in a course all about it, we could really hone that message. And then also thinking about how to write not just a statistical report for your peers, but also to broaden that to a wider audience. So we did things like blogs, press releases, that kind of thing. And this class sort of sparked the book that we ended up writing about communicating with data more broadly. So it does focus a lot on the statistical report, but it's not just that. It's things like reading, it's things like coding, it's things like visualization. It's even your social media presence, like Twitter counts as writing. And so thinking through that, we learned a lot through actually writing the book about writing. It got very meta. This year I spent at Smith College, where I also taught the communicating with data class that Amelia mentioned, Small World. Like she said, it was very different than the seminar I taught at Berkeley. So it was much bigger, no prerequisites. So we can't do things in R easily. You can't even focus on analysis. So we focused on more of the narrative, the description, the visualization. And doing it in the pandemic, we tried to do some creative things. We did data art, deer data, tactile visualization, so physical representations of data. We got a cool maker kit situation. Love to talk more about that at another time. And hoping to do more of that sort of data communication at Bucknell. I guess my 2 tips that I have prepared here is like, first, you really have to understand that you are a writer. I think this is maybe non-trivial in that when I started working with Deb, I was very self-conscious about my writing. I guess I still am. It's probably still my weakest thing. As quantitative people, we might like shy away from it. And so I got very meta, like reading a lot of other writers. How do they write? And like when I'm reading, paying more attention to why I like something or why does this visualization speak to me? Like trying to understand, like unpack my gut reaction to things so that I'm sort of practicing what I preach. And also just pushing myself to write for broader audiences. So when I was a grad student, I had a lot of cool opportunities to work in sort of non-academic writing spaces. So I interned at the LA Times on the data desk. That taught me a lot about journalistic points of view. I wrote scripts for the complexly crash course data literacy. That taught me a lot. So just seeking out those opportunities, just the pudding, if you care about Kids Bop lyrics, I have a thing about that. And so I really just like, I needed to feel like I knew what I was doing and I had to do it to really learn that. And then using what I learned there to bring it back to the students and have some concrete things that I know the backstory about to talk through as examples, I think is really helpful. I think the other thing is that you're probably already communicating a lot and teaching your students to communicate, but you're not flagging it as communication. So I think when students know that a final report and a presentation is like checking the communication box, but probably all throughout the semester, you're doing things that still count. Like you're reading, you're writing code, you're doing peer review, you're talking to your peers, like all of that is communicating. Captions is writing, like visualizations are writing. And so just even flagging that when you're doing it, I think can help students realize that it really permeates everything we do. It's not just that thing at the end, like, oh, now I share my results. It's happening all the time. And it's a nice step 0 if you're like, oh no, how do I do communicating with data in my life? You're already doing it, just say you're doing it. And so with that, I'll probably stop yammering on, but I'm looking forward to talking with you all.
Great, thanks. We're gonna now enter the next phase where I'm gonna ask a specific question and ask 2 of the panelists to answer it. And hopefully they'll take turns. One will take a minute to give their answer, the other will take a minute to give theirs, and then maybe we can have another couple minutes of an exchange between our 2 panelists to try to simulate a little bit of a conversation here. So my first question is, there are many different places in a student's academic career where communication training could occur. What kind of advice do you give us, or can you give us, about where that might happen? And I'd like to ask Jeff and Amelia to address this. And who would like to go first? Is there a preference? Jeff just turned off his.
I was going to just volunteer Amelia. I turned it off just to volunteer Amelia to go first. So. Amelia, do you want to go?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I think it's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think, to Sarah's point, there's communication everywhere. And if you can be flagging that throughout the student's academic career, I think that is ideal. Another sort of dream of mine would be that students would take 2 communication related courses, one super early on in their career, like this no prereqs data viz kind of appreciation and making course that Sara and I think have both taught, and then maybe one later in their academic career, where you can get into a lot more of the technical details. I know with my data communication course that I teach here, I had almost all seniors in my class this past semester. And in my evaluations, many students mentioned that they wish that they'd taken it earlier, like in their junior year, so they could have applied what they learned to their senior capstone. And so I think you don't want to leave it till the very last thing, but having a little bit more technical acumen can help you, make those really polished visualizations or, give a really polished talk later in your career.
I would say this is maybe a little boring, but I sort of agree with what Amelia has to say, again, being the amateur on the panel. But I would say that for us, we've kind of done 2 things for the more sort of beginning career people. When you don't have the technical skill, we tend to give them visualizations that somebody else made and then make the students kind of do the communication wraparound so they don't have to have the technical skills. I know that that's like probably what everybody does, but we just realized that that's what you should do. So I'm reporting it. And then the sort of later stages, so we use the open case studies that was developed by Stephanie Hicks and her group for that, where they have complete analyses that are kind of already done on like 10 or 15 different data sets that are kind of, so you can just pull a piece out of that and give it to somebody and then say, why don't you describe it in your own words? And then we think of the last, we use it as like the capstone course in the PhD program here at Hopkins, where it's the writing is the synthesis of all the different, the communication is the synthesis of everything you learned in the PhD program, a little bit of programming, a little bit of statistical modeling, a little bit of methods development. You have to kind of wrap it up into a coherent piece. So we sort of use it at the sort of beginning of the program and the end of the program here. Though I really liked, somebody else mentioned the idea, I don't remember who it was, of sort of sprinkling it into other courses, not just having it be in standalone courses. But that's the 2 kind of specific places we put it, is at the very beginning and at the very end is sort of, we kind of bookend people's experience.
I'm going to speak, I'm going to interrupt our flow here and ask Sara, even though I said only 2 people would speak. Can you talk about the portfolio at this point?
Oh, there I am. So Deb and I are thinking a lot about, just to echo what you're saying, it makes me feel good to other people confirm that happening twice and throughout would be good. Thinking about a portfolio of communication written large. So not just a bunch of written stuff, but your best plots or your most improved plots, or beyond just graphs and writing, but maybe you do a podcast for your class, or I know Amelia does a Wikipedia entry, any form of that, but to collect these things throughout your career at school, your 4 years, so that you have something for your job interview. I guess coding portfolios are pretty common these days, and just thinking of it as a layer on that. And instead of having homework assignments that just go into the void, really trying to make sure you end up with a set of products that you can then talk about in an interview or just have online if you're trying to get another position. But also just feel that it's less traditional than the products you've been making, especially in STEM. I think it's very exam, labs, problem sets, and trying to go beyond that. I think is it good.
Thanks, Sara. How about we go on to the next question, because I already broke the flow, but this is for Trity and Sara. If you're thinking about someone who's just starting to look into ways to bring communication into, let's say, a major program or into their courses or whatever, what one concrete step would you suggest for a faculty to take towards improving their training for students in communication? So Trity, go ahead.
Say test the waters. The way that we started at Caltech was we did small targeted workshops, right? Get a few students, and then we made sure that it was different levels. So we had undergrads, graduate students, and postdocs all involved. And set up the session. So the way we set it up was we would provide information for in a 1.5 hour session the first week. We would give them very specific homework to go and work on the second week, and then we would bring them back together the third week to see how they did, how much they incorporated the new lessons that they were learning. What we're talking about here is changing behavior. It's not easy. You're changing the behavior of someone who has communicated in a certain way for a while. You're also changing the behavior of institutions to consider communications as one of the core skills that are taught in STEM. So I would say test the waters, start small, and sorry, one more thing, whatever you're doing, model it, right? So, and as you stand up at a faculty meeting model, I'm going to be talking about these 3 things because I've learned that this is the way to communicate more clearly. As you're standing in front of your classroom, say, today I'm going to test out not just having a PowerPoint, but also having talking points to walk. Whatever it is, as you're learning and as you're growing as a communicator, share that with your group so that they see that this is a process we're all going through.
Great, thanks. How about you, Amelia? Oh, sorry, Sara. This was Trity and Sara. Excuse me.
No worries. I love the idea of workshops. I think what came to mind for me with this question is like I was teaching intro stat in the fall and spring, and I also wanted to do a little like communication magic there. And so I guess my advice is to turn one problem set, if you're doing a problem set class, that's I think of a lot of us, into a writing assignment, just one. The one I like to do is actually the first week, where it's just like, what is a question you want to know that you could answer with data, and then describe the best case scenario data. Like, what do you need? How many people do you want to talk to? Are they people? Just like, if I gave you unlimited money, what would you do? And instead of, rattling off a bulleted list, like ask for 2 paragraphs. I like it because it sort of, 1, gets the personality of the students, but 2, signals that the class is not going to be calculation only. I think a lot of students were like, oh, I didn't know I would be writing so much in this class. And I like to just be upfront about it. But that's just one way to sort of signal that the homework is not always numbers. And so I think it's an actionable thing to just, halfway in the semester when everyone feels a little tired, maybe throw something fun in there. More fun to grade too. So that's my semi-pro tip.
Do either of you want to react to what the other person said?
I really liked your suggestion, Sara. And I think it was Amelia who was it was you, Sara, mentioning the portfolio. Just to go back to that, the last session of our grad course was for each of the students to present their form of communication. So whether it was a poster, podcast, whether it was a video, whether it was a dance, whatever it was, they would showcase that in a set. We would have students writing an Instagram story about that to go on the main channel for Caltech. So it's always like those things, so you get some experience in it.
Someone in the chat mentioned multimedia, and your description of Instagram called that to mind. Is that so? It sounds like you are also using other forms of communication other than writing and making visualizations.
I think the only thing I have to add is that I think the winter or JTerm or whatever you call it is really like a sweet spot. Like my dream is to like get communication in there. Not that I don't think it's important during the semester, but realizing that like there are a billion classes students have to take, et cetera. And like JTerm would be a great time to do like a targeted, focused, maybe small group effort. And thinking about when Trity was talking about workshops, like, yes, could we make a concerted effort to use that time wisely as a pivot point if you're not ready to make a class a full semester long?
So I think we're veering into the next question. And so I'm going to take this as an opportunity. The next question I was going to pose to Trity and Jeff. So maybe I'll just look to you, Jeff, to chime in here about, in addition to classes, so we've heard a little bit about JTerm and workshops, but in addition to classes, what other ways can students be trained to be more effective science communicators?
I mean, again, our experiences, and this is where sort of the point that our best science communicators that come out of our program are writing about things they care about on platforms that they like. So if that's Instagram, that's great. Our kind of two kind of key examples that come to my mind are Hillary Parker was a student in our program a few years ago and wrote this blog post that's quite hilarious about her name being the most poisoned baby name in the history of baby names in the census data. And it was very personal, and it was very kind of cheeky and funny, and it was data analytic. I mean, it was quite, she talked about odds ratios and all sorts of things. But it was sort of clear that she did it purely for fun. And I think that she got a lot of feedback on it. It ended up in New York Magazine. It was sort of a great experience for her. We had another great experience like that with Alyssa Frazee with an analysis she did for fun. And so I think, for me, I think that science communication, it should be a part of core curricula, but I think it can also be this kind of expressive, fun, creative way. And that can, I think encouraging that is a great way to get people to get quick feedback. There are questions always about how do you scale feedback, and the quickest way to get feedback is put anything on the internet. You get very quick feedback. Some of it you don't want, but it's a good way to sort of get it out there, I think.
Great, thanks. Trity, do you want to react to that or have anything else to add?
I'm going to build on Jeff's comment about getting feedback. So just-in-time training is what I would talk about, and it's when the student's ready. For instance, the student's been invited to give a poster at a conference. Just before they're about to go, as they're preparing their poster, create a small group for them to practice and get feedback on that poster, or if it's a presentation, or if it's a job talk, right? Create environments for those students to practice and get both feedback on what they should do more of and what wasn't clear and what they could modify. And it kind of sits better when you are preparing for something, right? It's not just a course I took 2 years ago. It's I'm ready to stand in front of an audience.
Issues around doing that is to try to make sure that everybody's on board in a group of faculty to do that, right? I think this just-in-time sounds great, but I'm curious. I'll ask you a question to follow up on that. Do you see that this gets into my next question, which I'm going to ask of Sara and Amelia, but I'll start with you, Trity, what difficulties have you encountered with that kind of approach, which I think is a great approach, but.
So I would broaden it beyond faculty. It could be the student's peer group. If you're in a lab, it could be that you're an undergrad and a graduate student in that lab is part of the feedback group. It does not have to be a defense in front of 3 of your faculty members. It's just practicing. You could have input from more senior people who are familiar with that conference, but it's practicing and seeing, was I heard? Was my core message communicated the way that I wanted it to be communicated? Each of us comes into these meetings, in these situations with strengths, right? Which of my communication strengths did you connect with? And then I'm going to build on that, right? So does that answer your question, Deb?
In a way, yes. Jeff, do you have any comments? Do you want to add to this?
About the sort of just-in-time nature or the peer review,
or whatever, yeah.
I really like this idea, just building on Trity's point of, at least for us, we try to depressurize the critiques by having it be peer critiques. And I know I see in the chat, lots of other people do that too. It's not like we invented that. But I do think that peer critique approach is really helpful. The other thing that has been helpful for us is having, 1 or 2 faculty members do a critique of someone's data analysis while other people in the audience watch. And so that you get to see someone else's sort of work. It's sort of a way to scale that feedback to everyone watching. But that's tricky, and you have to be very careful about not making people feel uncomfortable. And so sometimes we've been successful at that, and sometimes I would say we haven't, but we try really hard to be really constructive in our feedback. And that also hopefully models for the peer assessments sort of a constructive approach to talking about communication, where we try to keep people really positive instead of being negative about each other's work. So I think that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. So next question is for Amelia and Sara. and it's a bit of a negative question. So basically, it's asking you what has not worked. So what particular approaches have you tried that have really not been successful, and what have you learned from these experiments? And I'll let you two decide who goes first.
You were indicating I should go first, Sarah. Well, so the thing that comes to mind most immediately is this Wikipedia assignment that I mentioned in my introduction. And I wouldn't say that it is like a total failure, but it has been a source of frustration. I think I've done it 3 times. And I'm trying to decide if I should even do it again in the fall. I think it has some real benefits. So I prepare a list of people, mostly in data visualization, data art, data science, who don't have Wikipedia articles already. I think my students actually wrote Jeff's Wikipedia article. Is that true? Okay. And so I say, I think these, 30 people are notable enough that they should have a Wikipedia article. There's 20 of you. You get to pick, who you want. You should do some research first to see if they're going to meet the notability bar, because Wikipedia won't let an article on just about anyone. They have to be notable. And doing the Wikipedia assignment, I think, it teaches some research skills. It has this kind of pressure of it's going to be on the web and everyone's going to be able to see it. I want to do a nice job. There's some, a new markup language that they have to learn. You kind of work on it in stages. So it's like a little baby step toward version control. You say, here are the changes that I made, and you can see the difference between the old and the new. So it's got all these nice qualities. The thing that is really hard is that then the article goes onto Wikipedia, and Wikipedia editors are they're not nice people as a rule, as far as I can tell. They have not learned to be very gentle communicators, or to do that kind of feedback where you kind of do like a compliment sandwich, like this part is good, you need to work on this, but this was really good. They're just like, this is terrible, this person is not notable enough, your writing is bad. Like, it is just very direct. And it sometimes verges on like sort of harassment. So then students get roped into the real world of the internet. And then I also get roped into it because I feel like I want those Wikipedia articles to survive. And so then I spend a lot of energy trying to get them to survive. Anyway, and then the question is it really data communication if you're writing an article about a person? Maybe you fit better in my data journalism course, where it's like sort of that neutral writing style, kind of profile writing, but maybe it doesn't fit as well in a general data communication course. So.
Thank you. And before we turn to Sara, great job if you made it through the over the barrier.
Well, I think probably due to a lot of hard work by Amelia's students, so I appreciate it. And my parents really appreciate that. So thanks, Amelia.
Yeah, no, even like I think I used your page as an example when I presented about this at SDSS, because the reviewers were like, well, he seems like he should be notable. Like, they had some pretty sassy things to say about you, I don't know, as a person, or the students writing. It's kind of hard to separate too when it's about a living person. Like, is this like sort of mean stuff about the person or about the writing, or kind of both?
They probably had a point, but my parents still like the article. So.
Well, good.
All right, Sara, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I think mine is sort of a little more general, but when I was thinking about how I tried to do the communicating with data class in the fall, I had like 4 mini projects, and I tried to make them like, I want to say fun, but like maybe my sense of fun is maybe not the same, but like non-traditional products, because it was like, remote, pandemic. I was just like, we got to get through this. And I had all these rubrics, and I was like, if you have these elements, don't worry about your grade. Like, it's like, have these constraints, and then anything else is fair game. But I found that like this was still hard for students, because it's not like a report where they at least have a vague sense of what a report should be. And then I would do an example, but then all of them would look exactly like my example. Like, we did Dear Data a couple times, and I make my own, because the real Dear Data ones are very beautiful and scary if you're not an artist. But then I'd say at least half of the students made Dear Datas that were very inspired by my like random art. And so trying to find this balance of like, I want to give you structure so that you're not overwhelmed, but I don't want to receive 60 of the same thing. And like, this is supposed to be a creative outlet, like the data viz. I'm like, there are no rules except for the rubric, right? And I think this is part is just like my first time teaching it. I'm like new to teaching in general. I don't think that's a secret, but I think it's just like when you want to do non-traditional products and no one has any like baseline gut reaction, your calibration becomes very strong. And so I think what I just need to do is make more examples so that they at least have to synthesize what's going on, and I will at least like get a mesh of my 5 instead of my exact copy back. But I'm also hoping that as these things happen at more institutions, we can all like share examples, and that will be less onerous on me. But if anyone has ideas beyond the like check off rubric to get at that balance, I would welcome it.
I also do that Dear Data assignment and have done it a number of times. And I love it, but I find it hard to grade. And the quality is very variable, and I don't want to judge people's drawing skills because that's like not the point.
I taught a Dear Data seminar this spring, and we had students sending postcards to each other, and I found that their book, Observe, Collect, Draw, was a really good way to sort of stage assignments around Dear Data. It helped sort of break it down to think about different ways to represent information in a visual. We're so used to how you make a scatter plot or a bar plot that it's hard to break away from that. Anyway, it broke it down into little pieces, but then you have to spend a lot of time on the Dear Data assignment. All right, my next question is for Trity and Amelia, and it's asking about the issue of evaluation. So we've already touched on this. Sara touched on this around rubrics, but it's sort of, how do you go about evaluating both the effectiveness of your teaching of communication, as well as how do you evaluate student work? So I've sort of expanded the question a little bit. Trity, why don't you start off?
So, by the way, I apply this approach not only to when I'm teaching, to whenever I'm doing a presentation, right? I make sure that from the beginning they know that I wanted to do better, so I present them with the types of input I'm looking for. So I'd say, as I do this presentation, let me know, was I clear about my core message? If I've identified you as my target audience, did you capture what I was trying to say? What I saying applicable to your next step, right? So I present myself as an example no matter what. With the classes that I've taught, we were very intentional about the students taking their science and engineering, for instance, into a policy realm. So was what you were taught relevant to you sitting next to a policymaker and talking about earthquake infrastructure, right? And then you really evaluate their communication and the transfer of this skill into another area. It's not just about, did you do a really good job of talking about that paper? Also matching up, I can't remember which of my fellow panelists talked about journalism, but matching up communications and PR people with the students was helpful. How do you take what you had written in your peer-reviewed published paper into a news piece or into a social media piece, and did it get traction? Was it engaging enough that it was shared through bigger networks than that exist for you right now? Was an article written in a journal, in a publication that is not common in your area?
Amelia?
Yeah, I think I have just a much more, sort of academics view of assessment, and the sort of like how do we, our department and the institution, evaluate it? I don't know how my department or my institution evaluates my work. And then, like I was starting to hint at with my comment to Sara, I do find it hard to assess work in these communication classes. Like, I think building rubrics is super helpful. But even that is like, you know, how do you say that it is good communication work? For the final project in my course, I had students do a product and then a meta document that went along with it. And the meta document, they had to justify all their decisions. Like, I chose to round the numbers like this because I chose this color scheme, because I chose to, you know, make the graph side by side, or, you know, whatever it was. I wanted them to justify all their choices, and particularly sort of situate them in the appropriate audience. So like, because I'm writing for this, you know, journalistic outlet, this was the appropriate choice. And students, I think, actually struggled with that. So I need to do a better job scaffolding that kind of practice throughout the semester of like justifying choices, because I think it's easier to say, okay, I'm going to mark you down because you didn't justify any of your choices. You just made something, versus I'm going to mark you down because, you know, you maybe made the wrong choice. I don't know. That's really hard for me to say. So those are just some thoughts.
I like Jeff. I like that idea of the meta document. It sort of follows what Trity was saying. Like, as you're an instructor, you're trying to verbalize or make clear all the different decisions you're making as you do your presentation. It's a similar thing. Do either of you want to respond to each other's? Good. All right. My last question is to Jeff and Sara. So, and it's about scale. And when Sara and I taught our seminar, we had 15 students in it. Our classes for data science, we have 1,100 declared. So scale is a really big issue. The other thing I wanted to mention, and connected to what Amelia was saying around rubrics, is I think we have a lot to learn from our our colleagues who are in arts and humanities about how do we assess student work, so we don't, you know, reinvent the wheel, and maybe it is a less perfectly shaped wheel that we're inventing. But for anyway, back to my question: is scale is a really big issue for us. And so Jeff, I know you teach many people in your Coursera approach to teaching. And so what do you, both of you, what comments do you have around scaling teaching communication? And we'll start with Jeff.
Sure. So I'll say we use rubrics. A lot of folks do and have kind of adopted that approach. Also, sort of by necessity, for something that's amorphous, we have to do peer grading at this sort of. The scale has come down a little bit over the years, but it used to be 100,000 students a month, so I wasn't going to grade that many homework assignments. So it sort of necessitated an approach to peer review, which I think it can be valuable. We did a little analysis early on that showed for the sort of best sort of writing, our scores correlated very highly, and for the worst writing, our scores correlated very highly. But for anything in the middle, it was just like a cloud of, and who's to say whether our score was right or the peer reviewer's score was right? So I find it, you know, except for the very obviously good and the very obviously bad, it's quite hard to come up with a scale that makes sense. The thing we've definitely thought about is we think of it as, and this kind of goes to in my heart, I hate grades. I'm a professor and I hate grades and I hate grading and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So I always think of this as like, we're just trying to make people's writing better. And so if the peer grading can help move them towards better, even if the assessment isn't perfect, we're kind of okay with that. And so we're sort of thinking that same way in our local courses too, is we try to really de-emphasize grades and really emphasize improvement. You know, that maybe doesn't fly with all the academic sort of standards committees and all that kind of stuff, but it's sort of my personal, and tenure's got to be good for something, right? So I have stopped caring about grades less and less as I get more senior. So anyway, so peer grading is basically the only way to scale, and I don't know if that's that great, at least in our experience. I mean, it's useful, but obviously the intensive way is more useful, at least for us. So I'd love to hear if somebody has a solution to this problem.
Perfect segue from the advanced professor to the assistant professor who maybe has to care about grading. But how do you scale? What do you
Well, honestly, it's like I understand the pragmatic, like we have to scale. It's not really a choice. But like English still does writing seminars in 12 and 15-person groups, right? That's not like that for a reason. I know it would take a crazy amount of resources to keep it that way. But like there must be something there. And I really feel like the writing has to be, I always say, frequent and low stakes, but then I have to, pass through all of those frequent things, and just getting the feedback that quickly, I just have a really hard time with it. I know I need to do peer feedback better, because everyone's like, yes, do peer feedback. This will help make your life easier. But I get a lot of pushback from students who want my eyes on stuff, understandably, because like I will give them a grade in the end. And so I really think I just need to do a better job of framing and setting it up. And I also think maybe when you're not remote, the community of practice is better for that, but it just feels like you're sending feedback into the void. Maybe this year was a weird case. But I hope that there's a way to do something creative to keep it small somehow. Like, you have a small lab, or maybe you make sure everyone takes a workshop sometime that they get more immediate feedback. I love the idea Jeff said earlier of doing like live feedback for a room. Like I had never thought about that. That seems like that helps scale. Or really, I'm just like begging you to tell me how to do peer feedback better. But if I had infinite money, I would keep it at 12 to 15, divide that by 1,000, whatever it takes, unfortunately.
Can I ask a quick question that is to the audience, because I think anybody might be able to answer this. There's this trade-off, at least I've experienced, in standardization versus creativity that I think Amelia already mentioned it, Sara already mentioned it, Trity might have also mentioned it, but it's this, you can either make it one really standard assignment that's easy to grade, but then you're like removing all the fun and creativity, or you can go all the way the other way where you can do whatever you want, but then grading is a nightmare. So does anybody have like a thought on how they manage that? I'm just really curious how other people manage that trade-off.
Well, I just had a sort of random thought which occurred to me as Sara was speaking, which is that oftentimes, so I am also about like improvement. And so every single thing in my communication class, there's a first draft, there's editing, and they do a final draft. Because I think that is something that we often don't do like in stats classes. And the way that I've done it is they do a first draft, they get peer feedback, they do a final draft, and then I grade it. But that, like, me giving them feedback there is sort of throwing it into the void, right? I've even heard for final projects, students don't look at the comments at all. So you can just like assign a number and no written feedback at all. So I wonder if it would be better to flip it on its head. That feels crazy to me, but have me give the feedback on the rough draft and then have the peers do the grades on the final draft.
I bet there'd be a lot of bartering going on. It's an interesting idea.
Logistically, because the end of the semester is just like a mess for grading, and like I'm tempted. I like that.
I'll throw another really different idea out there. I don't know if it's really different, but Sara made the point of saying our writing classes are really small on most of our campuses. And so there's funding already there to support writing. Maybe we need to do a better job partnering with those departments and retool some of those classes so that they are about writing about data. So we're almost out of time. Any last minute questions? Work with the Writing Center if you have one. Thanks for that. Any last comments from our panelists, or anybody want to type something into the chat?
I wanted to point out there's been a couple of really cool ideas that have been gone by in the chat that people should read. Hopefully this will be part of the recording, but other folks.
Can you summarize them for us, Jeff?
Yeah, so one was from Rachel, who mentioned having people do a video of their data analytic, like a self-description of their work. which I think is a really neat idea. And then Elin mentioned that like the writing workshops, still do a lot of peer feedback. So maybe that is something that is true in the humanities as well as, I think as Deb mentioned, trying to learn from people who've been doing this for longer than us is a good idea. So there's probably more, but those are the two I remembered.
Great. All right. Thank you, everybody. Why don't we can just wrap it up, and if anybody wants to hang around with us and ask questions, you're welcome to. Do you guys have questions you want to ask of each other?
Well, so there was some conversation earlier in the chat. What's the status of the book? It's been published. Is it out of stock? Tell us about the book, Sara and Deb.
Sara's more on top of it than me, but it has been published. I put it twice. Sara put it once, and I put it in the chat. There's a discount code of 30% off, which Sara tweeted. Sara, do you want to say more about it?
I was not aware that it was sold out, but that's, I guess, good news for us.
They can print more copies really easily.
Right. I think, yeah. And I know recently it's on Amazon. I think last time I checked it wasn't, but I saw some Amazon links going around.
Yeah, when I go to the Oxford University Press site, the paperback says this item is out of stock. And when I go to the hardcover, it says this item is not yet published. It is available for pre-orders and will ship on 25 April 2021, which I realized now is in the past.
Yes.
Time, such a strange.
So Heather just bought it.
Okay. Yeah, so.
I would not buy the hardback. I think we wanted to keep it small and as inexpensive as possible. So I would hope that it would be back in stock soon.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Maybe like me, I'm teaching this class again, maybe like my university bought 1 million copies for the students for the bookstore. Maybe everyone's getting their bookstores on it for the fall.
Well, that would be lovely.
Yeah. You'll soon get a royalty check for 13 cents.
Yeah.
I guess the other plug is if you are going to use it, we'd love to hear from you, good or bad. We're eventually, we have plans to have an organized spot for other people doing stuff that we can report back. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, I love the readings, and I have students do reading reactions, and they have really nice responses. But to me, the most valuable thing are the exercises that it would have taken me so long to think of those exercises, and they're really good activities to do. So I appreciate you putting those into a book about communication.